Did Jesus claim to be God? This was the topic for the recent epic debate between David Wood and Alex O'Connor, the Cosmic Skeptic. David Wood is here with us today for the first time to speak now that it's kind of been a week, looking back on the debate, giving us your feedback. First off, congratulations on blowing up the Christian and skeptical internet because it's been the topic of conversation. But I'm eager to get your reflections and thoughts about the debate. Thanks for flying all the way out here to Southern California to sit down with me.
Well, you have a fine show, Sean, so.
Good start. All right, so I've got a few backstories. We have some clips that we're gonna walk through. I want to get your reaction to. But I have a few kind of 30,000-foot view just questions because you've done a lot of debates like this. Mm-hmm. What do you think is the value of a debate like this today? Because I'm torn, because a lot of people watch this, they like the drama, but I look at the comments, they're like, my guy won, your guy won. And I'm like, is anybody really concerned with truth here? What do you think the value is?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that debates are significantly more important than I do. Like, I think of them as like kind of introducing your arguments, seeing how your arguments stand up to criticism, and then you go back and reformulate your arguments based on the criticism, and then you go to the next debate, and it's similar to what you did in your research on the deaths of the apostles and so on. You do your research, you put it out there, and then people criticize it, and then you say, okay, well, if they've got a point, then I need to take that into consideration. And then you adapt. But it's the same thing. My background's in philosophy. It's like all philosophers do is you put out an argument and then you get your criticisms back and then you either modify it or eventually you have to reject it if you think, no, the criticisms are actually stronger than my argument and therefore I need to drop it. But
so why this debate?
Well, this was his idea and he wanted to debate it, and we were originally scheduled to debate it at DebateCon. But I thought it was interesting in that normally, this is a topic you debate with Muslims. I've had a number of debates with atheists. It's usually on the existence of God or some argument for the existence of God or the problem of evil, an argument against the existence of God. So
makes sense.
Arguments with atheists are usually along those lines, whereas Muslims, you're not arguing whether God exists or something like that, or whether there's a supernatural or anything like that. You're debating, did Jesus claim to be God? Did he rise from the dead? Is the New Testament reliable? And so on. So you have a different collection of interests there, but here you had an atheist who's interested in what Jesus claimed. So,
yeah, that is fascinating. I guess he's been spending a good amount of his time thinking about this very topic. So maybe sum up for us your basic case that you took and why you gave the case and the approach that you took.
There are obviously a bunch of different ways you can argue that Jesus is claiming to be God in the New Testament. I use the argument I use just because I think it's kind of overlooked, and I think it's pretty obvious what's going on once you understand what's going on in the first century. So going back, and we have this in Philo of Alexandria, who was first century BC to first century AD, but he starts talking about he's talking about these two powers in heaven, and you had in the Targums, the Targums were basically translations from Hebrew into Aramaic, but they would add commentaries. They would add some commentaries in there, and they give some very interesting commentaries on how they're interpreting certain Old Testament texts, and it just kept coming up that there are all these passages where it seems like there are two powers in heaven. And Alan Siegel wrote his book that brought this to light.
He's Jewish, by the way, not Christian.
Yeah, and he brought this out there that in the first century you have this fairly common belief that there are somehow two powers in heaven, and they're trying to figure out how you reconcile that with monotheism because they don't want to compromise monotheism, and yet they can't ignore what some of these passages really sound like they're saying. So they tried to deal with this in different ways, and eventually it gets deemed heretical within Judaism. But this is afterwards. In the first century, it's fairly common, and people wouldn't have had really a problem with saying, hey, this passage looks like there are two powers in heaven. What they would have a problem with is saying, this guy from Nazareth is one of them. But once you understand that, all these passages fall into place of what's going on. We see Jesus doing it multiple times and in multiple ways, with the Father-Son language, with him trying to modify their idea of the Messiah, saying, hey, whose son is the Messiah? Oh, son of David. Well, actually, David calls him Lord, so what's going on there? And then, of course, at his trial, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And he said, yes. And well, he said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man coming, seated at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven. And so, but all these passages are doing the same thing. It's Father, Son, Lord, Lord, Ancient of Days, and Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. It seems in all these cases, he's saying, hey, yeah, there are these two powers that you guys are familiar with, and I'm one of them. But then you just see everyone else doing the same thing. With John, it's in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, drawing a distinction between the Word and God, and yet calling the Word God. You got it, and you have the same thing in the Philippians creed or hymn, whatever it happens to be. But he's in nature God, or in the form of God, but he humbles himself. And then later he's exalted by God to the highest, to have the highest name, which would be Yahweh. And so what's going on? He's in nature God, he humbles himself, but there's God who exalts him after he humbles himself. What's going on here? You just see this over and over again. They keep referring to these two powers and saying that Jesus is one of them. And then Alex actually brought up the stoning of Stephen, but as soon as he did, I pointed out at the end there what really causes the Jewish leaders and the people there to flip out.
The violence, so to speak.
I mean, Stephen is brutally rebuking them. It's like, your ancestors killed the prophets, and look what you did to the Messiah. Yeah. And they're sitting there taking it. They're mad, but they're taking it until he says, hey, I see God and I see Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. That's when they close their ears and they rush at him. And this is clearly something that's enraging them. And again, it wouldn't have been terribly controversial to say two powers in heaven. You would have to. The idea was, we're still wrestling with this. We have to figure out how this is still monotheistic. So they're still wrestling with it. Again, the problem would be that the carpenter from Nazareth, is the guy who built your cousin Ezra's table in Nazareth, that guy's one of those two powers. That's what really sets people off. And so it's just a situation where everyone seems to be doing the same thing. And it's not in one source or in one later source or something like that. It's, you go Mark, it's in there multiple times. You go Q, it's in there. You go Matthew, you go, whether you're just going through the Gospels or you're going to the sources behind the sources that the scholars are talking about, it's just everywhere, and everyone is kind of doing the same thing, but they're all doing it in different ways. Again, it's Ancient of Days, Son of Man, Father, Son, Lord, Lord, in nature God, but also exalted by God, God and the Word who was God. And it just seems everyone's doing the exact same thing. And it's like, it's in too many places, in too many different ways. Let me put it this way. Since it's in different places in so many different ways, it seems like it's people independently doing it, but they're all doing the same thing.
I didn't expect you to take that route, going back to the Old Testament and laying it out, which was helpful rather than just jumping to the New Testament. Two questions, then I got 4 clips I want you to react to. It's been a week since this debate. Do you have any reflections back now that you've had time for it to settle? There's been a ton of activity online. You probably haven't even watched that, would be my guess. But looking back on it over a week, what are your thoughts now?
Pretty much the same, maybe a little better than when I walked out.
Okay.
I know people have been commenting. I haven't paid attention to any of it except for when people are just asking me something directly in a live stream or something like that. But while we're debating, I loved my opening argument. Okay. I like that argument. Rebuttals, I thought went pretty well. He seemed like he came in prepared to argue against certain positions that I didn't even make. And then he just kind of stuck with them. Like, it looked like he expected me to come in there and start arguing from John. And then he just starts in his opening statement going after John. And it's like, I brought in John as like a supplementary point, but my main argument was from the earlier material, that's normally what atheists demand. That's why I was doing it, right? They normally say you can't go to John because that
surprised me.
That's a later source. So you have to go to the earliest material. So I just come out arguing from the earliest material, and then he comes out arguing John. And so I thought that was interesting. But so I was fine with the opening statements and rebuttals. The discussion period. I just had I can tell you what I was planning as soon as we sat down, because he was giving his second rebuttal, and so he kept harping on the proskuneo. Even though, like I'd already explained it, so yes, that can mean in a totally normal human sense that you're just bowing to someone to show respect or something like that. There are other places where it's clearly a religious context, and that's when it would mean worship, and that's why it's translated as worship. So I said that quickly, but then in his second rebuttal, he kept going with it, like he prepared for it, like he prepared a bunch of arguments that, if you're saying proskuneo only means worship, look at all these people worshiping. No one said that ever. But anyway, was fine with all that. Then in the discussion period, kind of just had a massive energy crash, and I thought I looked physically thought I looked way worse than people said that I did. Because when I was describing it, people told me later after they watched it, like, oh, I thought you like fell over on stage the way you were describing it. But no, I just, it's basically, I normally stay up at night and then sleep during the day. And so when I traveled, I stayed up all night, and then instead of going to sleep, I traveled to California. And then you get to California and you have to do things during the day, and then you try to sleep at night, but I can't sleep at night because I'm not used to sleeping at night. And so anyway, that's what was going on. And so I drank a bunch of energy drinks before the debate, and then while he's giving his opening statement, I started zoning out. I started going, he's not talking about anything that's related to me right now, so I could just kind of not pay attention to this right now until he gets to something I'm talking about. And then I start realizing, no, he's sticking with this. He's actually sticking with all these points that I don't think are actually related to what I said. But if I don't pay attention right now, then I'm not going to have anything to say during I have to give a 12-minute rebuttal. So I have to be responding to what he's saying. And then, same thing in the first rebuttal and second rebuttal. But then, during the discussion period, it was I don't know if you've ever fallen asleep while driving. That's exactly what it felt like. That. And I didn't realize until I got home. I was like, I was massively sleep deprived. He probably was too, because he traveled across the ocean. So we're in the same boat, and I'm like, I'm used to it. I'm used to being massively sleep deprived. And I told my son, I said, I had a bunch of caffeine right beforehand. He goes, did you take caffeine pills or energy drinks? And I go, energy drinks. And he goes, the kind with tons of sugar in them? And I go, yeah. And he goes, I always crash after those. And it didn't even hit me, because I don't normally drink the sugary ones. I just figure, I'll get a bunch of sugar in me. Anyways, I felt really low energy, and I felt like I wasn't comprehending, and so I thought I just looked like I was falling asleep on stage.
I didn't think you physically looked.
Well, that's what other people said.
I didn't even know that. That's news to me.
That's why I said I felt a little better about that afterwards, because I assumed that I looked like I was ready to fall over, and people said, no, you look normal.
Fair enough.
Anyway.
All right, so I've got 4 clips for you, and these may or may not be the ones that you would pick, and there's a lot we're going to leave out and just not address because you guys covered a lot of ground. But these kind of seem to be illustrative, and people online were wrestling with these kind of passages. Mm-hmm. So this first clip has to deal with whether, Jesus could have risen Lazarus by his own accord, which is a question that Alex asked to you. Let's take a look at the clip, and then I want your reaction.
Right.
Could Jesus have risen Lazarus from the dead of his own accord, on his own authority?
I suppose, yeah.
I suppose.
Because all authority has been given to him.
It's been given to him by God, right? Which the way that I read that is that the Father has delegated the authority that is rightfully his to Jesus. And it's often said to me that Jesus raising people from the dead of his own authority is actually an indication of his divinity. Because we have Old Testament passages of people raising people from the dead, like Elijah and Elisha. And the point is always made that, they pray before they rise from the dead. Jesus doesn't pray. But before he raises Lazarus in John chapter 11, he looks upward and says, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so they may believe that you have sent me. And when he says this, he cries out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. So Jesus is not only praying before raising Lazarus, but also saying that I always do this. It's just I'm doing it right now publicly, so there's no confusion that you're the one who sent me to do this. And so even in instances where Jesus appears to perform miracles of his own accord, such as calming the storm, or indeed raising other people from the dead, like the widow's child, he tells us here in John's Gospel that he always is in communication with God beforehand, but right now he's saying so publicly so that people will know that he sent him. Why does Jesus need to pray before he raises Lazarus from the dead?
Now, I want your reaction to this, and I've had the chance to think about this, watch the debate a couple times. Obviously, you're thinking on the spot. But it seems like he's getting at the distinction that Peter and Paul and Elijah raised people from the dead, and apologists typically say, well, they had to pray for the power to do so. Jesus did from his own authority. And Alex is like, wait a second. In John 15, Jesus also prayed and says he always prays. Your thoughts, expansion on that clip in your response?
It's another situation where he seemed prepared for certain arguments that I wasn't using. And so he's pointing out Christians have argued this and so on. And then he kind of sticks with it, where notice that wasn't my argument. That wasn't my argument. Yeah, he's responding to a different point and just saying some people. So again, it seems like he showed up with a list of responses to arguments and then kind of rolled with the ones he kind of brought with him, even if I didn't bring them up. But as far as what this is actually saying, there's a couple things involved. What Jesus actually says, he's just acknowledging the Father here, right? What's the part that he thinks is showing that Jesus can't perform a miracle without, I guess, getting permission or something like that?
I think that's a fair question to ask of the text. I think he might be reading more into it that is there. I think that's fair. I have some thoughts on this. Anything else that you want to weigh into how you would say? Or go ahead.
I'm still not clear on what his point is, given what it's actually saying.
Given what John 15 actually says.
What do you mean? We talking about Lazarus? It's John 11.
Yeah, sorry, John 11.
Okay.
Good point. So exactly. The passage, so let me take a step back, and I'll tell you what I think about this, so you can tell me if you agree or disagree. I've thought about this question: could Jesus do this by his own accord? And I think your answer was, if Jesus is God, and being God means somebody has the ability to raise the dead, then Jesus would have such ability. So
that's a long. I can break down what I'm thinking along these lines. So as far as the actual passage, it says, "Then Jesus looked up and said, 'Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me.'" So he's saying that he's talking so that these people can hear him. And I guess Alex is interpreting this as Jesus can't do anything without praying, or Jesus can't do anything without receiving the authority to do so. Mm-hmm. And there are multiple directions you can go with for a response there. You could be thinking in terms of the eternal generation of the Son, or you could just be thinking in terms of Jesus is incarnate. He, according to Philippians, is in a state of humbling himself. And he's not there to glorify himself. It's the Father who exalts him after he has humbled himself. And so if you are in a state of humbling yourself, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, it seems to fit perfectly well with Christian theology, and not to be like, oh my goodness, Jesus is here as a human on earth, and he's speaking to the Father. So yeah, it's just a weird situation where it's like, okay, that's basic Christian theology. I don't know where you're going with this.
Fair enough. For me, I think logically Jesus could raise Lazarus from the dead without, the authority of the Father, because he's been given all authority. And if you are God and raising the dead is a part of being God, and Jesus was, he has this authority. Mm-hmm. But metaphysically, when we look at what John and the rest of the scriptures teach about the relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are not distinct beings, but they are one and always act in unison, then the answer, I think, would be no.
Well, then, by the way, that's the exact point Jesus makes in John 5.
That's
they
right.
kind of accuse him of you're some additional God, and then he clarifies. And then when he's talking about it, he's no, I'm not. And Muslims actually use passages from John 5. I can of my own self do nothing. They say, see, Jesus can't do anything. It's no, separate from God, separate from the Father, I don't do anything. He's pointing out that he's not some additional separate God. He's one with the Father. But as far as on the issue of authority, can Jesus by his own power and authority do these things? I mean, I'm thinking in terms of something that came up a bunch. The Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, mm-hmm. from Daniel 7. You look at that, and he comes with the cloud, so he's already Yahweh. Yahweh's the one in the Old Testament who comes with the clouds. So he's already Yahweh, but he approaches the Ancient of Days and he's given authority. And so you look at that and it's like, wait, if he's already Yahweh, how is he then given authority? What sense does that make? Well, if you interpret that in light of things like the incarnation and so on, then I don't know. I think it all holds together really well. I think like impressively that you have Old Testament, New Testament, you have multiple sources. You can actually put them together. I mean, if you got like, John 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God.
I agree.
Word becomes flesh. You have the same thing in Philippians 2, that being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. So he's lowering himself. And then he lives here and he's saying that he's been given authority to do these things. But when? His incarnate state. And then he dies and rises from the dead and he comes back to his followers. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That sounds that sounds like you have in Daniel 7, 13 to 14, like a miniature version of the entire, basically, chronology of the Christ, that he's in nature God, that he lowers himself, and then that he's exalted. And so, I don't know, that seems to be everywhere as well.
I think you're right to go to John 5, where 19 through 21 says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise."
Yeah.
There's a necessary unity that's there because of their relationship. And of course, the Holy Spirit is well, in passages I won't go into. The passage itself, to go to it, it's interesting. Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, this is back to the Lazarus passage in 11. "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me." Now, he's saying, thank you that you hear me. He's not saying, I always pray for your power when I do a miracle.
Which is how Alex interprets
it. It doesn't say that. He says, but I said this on account of the people standing around. So he's modeling for them, in one sense, what it means to be the perfect human being in obedience to the Father, that they may believe that you sent me. So the miracle is a kind of sign to attest the identity that he's claimed throughout John and beyond. So I think, and of course, shortly before this, in 25 through 26, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. You pointed that out. That's one of the I am statements. I'll just contrast this, and we'll go to the next one. Maybe go back and look at some of the other miracle claims, Elijah, Peter, and Paul. And the one in Acts 3 jumps out to me as a contrast, because you have the apostles, in particular Peter here, who tells the lame man from birth, in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, rise up and walk. That's very different than Jesus' prayer saying, I know you always hear me. It's different. In this sense, I think it's clear the apostles are instruments through whom Jesus is the one who really heals. It's his name. It's his power. And Peter repeats this again in Acts 3, 13 through 16. It says, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the God of our fathers, glorified his servant Jesus, whom you delivered over and denied in the presence of Pilate, when he had decided to release him. But then they say, but you denied the holy and righteous one. Who's the holy and the righteous one? It seems to be Jesus. And asked for murder to be granted to you, and you killed the author of life. Who's the author of life? This is Jesus. And then it says, whom God raised from the dead. What's interesting about that is in John 2, what does it tell us? Jesus says, I lay down my life and I take it up again. So you have the Father, who told God the Father in this passage, raising the dead. Jesus raised the dead. Why? We're back to them working in perfect unison. Much more could be said here, but I don't think the argument and objection that he's raising, that Jesus is healing in the same manner as everybody else, really holds when we compare this passage in John 11 with Acts 3 and the other healings.
No, it doesn't. But I have to say, one thing I should point out. I love the approach.
In what sense? Tell me why.
In the sense that it's just a reversal of the way things normally go, right? So notice
the normal apologist argument.
The normal way the entire debate would go. Normally, it would be Christians arguing, taking passages about Jesus being God, and then the skeptics saying, I don't trust any of those sources. Those were later made up, and those were embellished, and that was legendary development and things like that. Whereas I come out arguing from our earliest material, and then he goes to the Gospel of John to interpret the earlier material in light of the Gospel of John. I mean, think about it. It's like, isn't that much better than Jesus? So you got Alex isn't a Jesus myther, but then you have the skeptics, and they're saying you can't trust the later material and so on. Wouldn't it be interesting if the new atheist thing became arguing by wrestling with the meanings of various claims in the Gospel of John and using those to interpret the earlier material? If they're going that road, I say,
you say
stick with that for a while. Go with that. Roll with that for like 5 years. Christians don't even bother like flipping out about it. Let these guys focus on John and saying, this is where we're going to get our Christology from. And
that's a great
see where
shift.
that goes.
I agree with that. Well said. Now, the other discussion we had is on John 32 to 34, in which Jesus cites Psalms 82, which is probably one of the most debated and contested passages in the New Testament. Let's watch this clip, and then I'll get your take.
There's one place in the Gospels where Jesus is directly accused of claiming to be God. Do you know where it is? It's in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, his Jewish opponents come to him and say, if you're the Messiah, tell us plainly. And Jesus responds by saying, I and the Father are one. I'm told by Christians this is a direct Christological claim. Who can claim to be identical to the Father except for someone who is God? And there was no confusion about this. The Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him to death for making this claim. Now, how does Jesus respond? Does he agree with them? Or does he correct them? He says, in response to the Jews, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? Quoting, as you'll probably realize, the psalm that I just quoted and explained briefly a moment ago. So, directly asked about his Christological status, Jesus decides to quote a psalm which is explicitly talking about beings who are not in fact Yahweh and yet are called gods. Why would he pick that psalm if the message he wanted to convey was that he is in fact in some sense God, that is, identical to Yahweh? Jesus continues, if he called them gods, why wouldn't he call me God, the one who the Father has sent and set aside? So why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? Like in the divine council, you shall be called gods, that is, sons of the Most High. So it's a misunderstanding. Jesus immediately afterwards clarifies further and says, believe the works, that is the works of my Father through me, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Another pretty intense Christological claim. What does it mean? Let's turn to the most important Christological chapter in John's Gospel, which is, of course, chapter 17. Jesus is praying, first for his disciples, then for all of his believers. Remember, in John chapter 10 so far, Jesus has made two claims. I and the Father are one, and I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, addressing the relationship that he has to his Father, which David thinks is the two powers in heaven. What does Jesus say in his own words? John chapter 17, verses 20 onwards. My prayer is not for them alone, the disciples. I pray also for those who believe in me through their message, that is, all of you, that all of them may be one. Hen, H-E-N, the same Greek word used in John 10. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. This is crucial, this is pivotal. When Jesus is asked to clarify his Christological status, what is his relationship to the Father? He says, I'm in the Father and the Father's in me. He then later prays that all of us will one day be in God in the same way, just as, kathos in the Greek, which doesn't just mean as, it means in the same way as, just as. If this is supposed to indicate that Jesus is claiming to be identical to Yahweh, what does that make the rest of us? And how, I'm interested in knowing, is David going to interpret these verses where Jesus is specifically asked to clarify his relationship to the Father and tells us that he is only in relationship with him in such a way that everybody else can be in relationship with them too?
All right, so there's a lot in this clip. John 32 goes to Psalm 82, but then brings back John 17, arguing that what he means by, the Father and I are one now means something different that includes us in John 17. your takeaway?
A couple of issues. As far as the Jesus saying you are gods, I responded to that, and that's my take on it. Is
Okay.
So Jesus calls himself the Son of God. They interpret that as claiming to be God, right? He's not using a metaphor. If you're claiming to be the Son of God, it is in a divine. They're interpreting him as claiming this in a divine sense. And so they object to this, and they're ready to kill him for it. And he responds, "Isn't it written in your law, you are gods?"
Mm-hmm.
And you look, and in the Old Testament, so that's Elohim there in the Psalm. That is a broader term than our term for God. It's used of our term. It can be used of God or of false gods. It's also used of angels, and in 82, I know there are other people who interpret it as like a heavenly council or something like that. I just interpret it as like heavenly judges who are the representatives of God. But regardless, you've got someone who's called Elohim, and Jesus points out, wait a minute. So they're saying, hey, you made this claim about yourself, and we're supposed to execute you for making this claim. And he responds, what are you talking about? It's in the law that God has called these people Elohim. Therefore, just because you say that someone has this divine title does not mean you execute them. You have to figure out whether this actually comes from God or if it's just this person making things up about himself. And so it's like a loophole in their law as far as what they're trying to do to him. He's saying, no, you have to determine whether this title comes from God. Otherwise, you can't execute me. So that's how I interpret it. Not that he's saying, one, you're gods, or that you guys are just as much gods as I am, or something like that. All that sounds weird. I don't know. Reading the passage, it just sounds like he's saying, you can't execute me for this. No, you can't.
There's another take on this that I think is really interesting. This comes from Ed Komashevsky and Rob Bowman in the recent book on the incarnate Christ. And they point out for most of church history, the gods were viewed as human rulers. That's how people interpreted Psalm 82. Today, most view the gods as kind of deities worshipped by other nations. But if you look in the Psalm itself, he announces that they will die like men. So his point is that they're not real gods at all, which makes sense. And he's criticizing them. They judge unjustly, show partiality to the wicked, don't give the right justice to the weak and the fatherless. They neither have knowledge nor understanding in verse 5. And of course, in verse 6, I said you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like princes. Now, what's interesting is what they give on this passage is they point towards 1035 in John, says Scripture cannot be broken. Now, this comes right after, obviously, verse 34. They would argue it's best understood as causing it to be unfulfilled is what it means for Scripture to be broken. You see the same interpretation in John 7:23. So this text in Psalm 82 is pointing forward towards positive fulfillment, so to speak. So they judge unjustly, but the Scriptures can't be broken. Jesus is the one who judges justly. They walk in darkness. Jesus was sinless. So they pick up stones to kill him. Now, I don't know if I can fully settle which of those two I land on, but I think they're both possible interpretations of this passage. But they both make sense of them picking up stones and him clearly claiming to be God, and they're plausible readings. And I think if the point was to say, oh, no, I'm not God, Jesus easily could have said, oh, I'm not making myself out to be God, and clarify this point. But he doesn't do that.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point. That's why in the debate I was talking about, it basically sounds like Alex was arguing that Jesus is just a terrible communicator. Because think, if Jesus here is saying, what? You guys are interpreting, what? That's what you think I'm saying? No, I'm not saying that. No one seems to have gotten that message. I mean, he's eventually executed, and all his followers walk away thinking that he's claiming to be divine. And so, like, by the end, it's basically two categories. There are people who are rejecting him as a blasphemer, and there are his followers who are praying to him and worshiping him. And so it's like, did people just miss this? Did people just miss it? Because it sounds like Alex's view is Jesus saying these claims, and people interpret it, and he's like, no, I'm going to clarify for you. Come on. Ye are gods. why would you interpret me as like seriously, like I'm seriously claiming to be divine when you have things like that? It's just like, if the entire Gospel of John makes no sense. I mean, it starts off, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and you have the incarnation, and then all the claims of Jesus, and then, towards the end, you have Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God.
Yeah.
You're basically stuck with, if you think Alex is right that Jesus was saying, one, I'd be interested, do you think this actually happened? You think this stuff in the Gospel of John, this conversation is accurately recorded and so on? Do you believe this happened when we're assessing the claims of Jesus? If you do, and if that's your theory, I don't know why you'd go with the theory that doesn't make sense of the entire rest of the book, instead of the views that we're talking about, which would make sense in light of the rest of the book. But it kind of forces you to say Jesus is a bad communicator.
He did say early on in the debate that he thinks John is the least reliable gospel. Actually would push back on that. And yet it's the one he
focused on the entire time.
Not here, but he's just saying for the sake of conversation, given that these are true, considered to be true by Christians, does he claim to be God?
But I actually have a problem with that. If we're asking the question, did Jesus claim to be God?
Oh, not just within the text. Did he actually claim to be God?
Yeah, I mean, if we're asking a historical question, did this person who lived at this time make a claim about himself? That's a historical question.
Agreed.
If you're going to text that you don't believe, and you don't even believe he said these things, because keep in mind, I'm sure Alex believes that there are certain claims in the New Testament that Jesus actually made. Mm-hmm. Do you believe he said this? And if you're just saying, well, for argument's sake, you Christians believe it. Well, the question isn't, do Christians believe that he claimed to be God? It's, did he make this claim? And so it's just weird to me to be making a historical claim and then to go to sources that you don't even believe in. So you don't believe they actually answer the question. You just believe, well, if you're a Christian, you have a problem in your theology or something like that.
Well, if he watches this and wants to clarify, it would be helpful to know. That's fair.
I'd be surprised if he actually believed that Jesus said these things.
I think so too. I think you're right about that.
And that would kind of be an issue. It would be, if you don't, then it's like, I don't know, kind of, what do you really think? Like, what do you really think he said? Like, that,
Yeah.
I'd be more interested in that.
Okay, fair enough. Now, I do think when he goes to John 17, I think John 17 is making a different point
Definitely.
than John 10 is. He makes himself out to be God. So the oneness there is in terms of his nature and his being. John 17, the whole point is he says in verse 20, he says, I do not ask these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they may also be in us. The question is, in what sense will they be in us? Mm-hmm. So that the world may believe that you have sent me. In other words, that there's this unity and this oneness that the world will see as a testimony backing up the claims of who Jesus is. Verse 26 says, I made known to them your name.
Back up.
Oh, go ahead.
Just back up one verse. So going to verse 25. Because if you're interpreting this as, hey, the disciples are basically just going to be like me. I'm just kind of further along than them, but they're going to be exactly like me. I mean, look at what this actually says in the same passage that Alex is pulling up. He says, righteous Father, though the world does not know you, I know you, and they know that you have sent me. Think about how that ties in with Matthew 11:27, which is also in Luke. So this is Q. This is early material. But Jesus says, all authority has been given to me. But he says, no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. But think about this. I'm the only one who really knows the Father. The Son is the only one who really knows the Father, but I can introduce you to him. It sounds like he has a special relationship. He's the one. It's like you've got Father and Son eternally, and then he's bringing other people into the relationship with them. And I don't know how you would avoid that in the passage, but look what Jesus says right here. This is lining up really well with Matthew 11:27, that no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. What's he say? Righteous Father, though the world does not know you, I know you, and they know that you have sent me. I have made you known to them and will continue to make you known in order that the love you have for me may be in them and that I myself may be in them. How you're interpreting this as Jesus is just claiming to be like his followers, and I don't know. It just seems which again, I'm happy if you want to go this route with John.
Fair enough.
Keep going with it. I do not believe it's going to be successful.
You invited. I mean, verse 5 it says, "And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed."
Mm-hmm.
Says it twice in this passage. So there's a certain kind of unity that pre-exists that's
from all
not
eternity.
the same. They're being brought into a oneness with them. In verse 26, on in this, we'll look at the next clip. He says, "And I made known to them your name, and I will continue to make it known, that the love which you have loved me may be in them, and I in them." How will they know us? By our love. That's the kind of unity he's talking about here, not the same kind of unity that God the Father has with Jesus. So I don't think you can just jump from chapter 10 to chapter 17 without the context. But with that said, a big issue that came up was on the question of the worship of Jesus. Now, this wasn't a part of your initial case, but it came up. A lot of people were talking about it. So let's watch this about 2.5-minute clip. I'll get your take.
We're told that Jesus only rightly accepts worship. This is interesting, by the way. David flashed on a few passages of Jesus accepting worship in the Gospels. The word most commonly translated as worship in the New Testament is proskuneo, which means to bow down or prostrate before a higher authority. And of course, Jesus received this proskuneo worship, therefore he must be God. If that is the case, then we have to consider the fact that David, in the Septuagint, for example, bows down proskuneo before Esau, that Joseph's brothers proskuneo before him when he's governor of Egypt, that the entire nation of Israel offers proskuneo worship to King David as well, that Lot proskuneo before two angels. Proskuneo is littered throughout the Old and also the New Testament, by the way. In the parable of the unmerciful servant, when one of the servants returns, he offers proskuneo to his master. And this is a story that Jesus is saying. Also, let's not forget that in Revelation, Jesus promises that his true followers, their enemies, will proskuneo worship before them. Jesus himself in Revelation is saying that human beings will receive proskuneo worship. If proskuneo worship is something that only God can receive, then all of these people sinned. All of them. The entire assembly of Israel sinned when they bowed down before David. I don't think that's a good interpretation. There is another word that's sometimes translated as worship, which is latruo. This is religious cultic worship that is only offered to God. Nowhere in the Gospels is this offered to Jesus. How many times is proskuneo worship, how many times is any kind of worship accepted by Jesus in Luke's Gospel? Does anybody know? 0. The word comes up 3 times. Twice in the temptation of the desert where it's discussed, and once at the end after Jesus has ascended so he can say nothing about it, and in a verse that's contested in our manuscript traditions. How many times in Mark does Jesus accept worship? This time the answer is 2, but one of those is the demon Legion. It's usually translated as throws himself at his feet before Jesus. And the other is when the Roman soldiers mockingly worship Jesus. They offer proskuneo. Why? Because he's the king of the Jews. Because proskuneo worship is something offered to kings, higher authorities. I'll keep going perhaps in my further rebuttal, but if worship is something that is only due to God, then there are a lot more sinners in the Bible than we think.
He had a little smirk. He liked the point that he was making. Give me your reaction to this.
Well, I responded to it, but then he made a much kind of bigger deal out of it, and I don't know if people caught it, because it's actually pretty simple. So proskuneo is like prostrating or bowing down, and it can be used in a just purely human sense of one person bowing down to show humility before another person. If it's in a religious context, it's the word for worship. That's how you refer to worshiping someone. And so this is actually what I was when he was giving his second rebuttal, because then he just kept going on and on with it when I explained that. I say, no, and if it's in a merely human context, here's what it would mean. If it's in a religious context, it means worship. And then I quoted a passage from Matthew where it's clearly a religious context. But then in his second rebuttal, he just kept going with it, more examples of, this would mean that this person's worshiping this. Like, I don't know if you missed what I said, but I acknowledged that, because everyone would acknowledge that proskuneo can just mean one person bowing down to another. But let me give you an example of.
Do it.
And so this is what I when he's giving a second rebuttal, and I knew that we were having a discussion period, I was like, okay, we can discuss this. And all I did was pull up the passages with proskuneo, and I was just going to go, does this sound like a religious context or merely just bowing down to a person? By the time we got to the point where it was mine, I was
spent.
Sugar
was kicking in.
Yeah. But yeah, look, so quick passage. This is Jesus walking on the water. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get in the boat and so on. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. So he's sinking. Jesus is walking on the water. He's sinking. Lord, save me. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. So he's walking on the water, sounds divine. Peter cries out, Lord, save me. Jesus saves him. He calms the storm in the sea. And it says what? That they sort of bowed down to him out of humility and called him the Son of God. It sounds like, all of that sounds like a religious context. And so you have passages like that. And it's just the meaning of proskuneo is determined by context, whether it's worship or whether it's a merely human. And I would just say you have multiple passages where it's, I would say, clearly religious.
I agree with that. I think probably most times, I think it's about 16 times, if I'm not mistaken, proskuneo is used in the New Testament towards Jesus. Probably most of those are not worshiping him as the eternal, uncreated Yahweh. They're not aware of that. But sometimes in the context, like you said, it seems pretty clear that much more is going on that leans towards that direction. I think the example you gave is a good one.
And by the way, just side note, even here, I don't think it's clear that the disciples really understand like divine nature type issues. It's more like they're terrified into just, we're hitting the deck here because there's something very, very different about this guy. But the context seems to be significantly more than you're asking a favor from someone, and so you bow down to show your humility.
I think you're right about that. I think even an example in Mark, where the demoniac, they kind of prostrate themselves. Well, is he aware that Jesus is fully God? Well, he's more powerful than a legion of 2,000 demons and has fear of him. So we're certainly moving in that direction early in Mark. And I agree with you, it's not till really the end of Mark, when you get to Mark 14, when he makes it clear that he's the Son of Man, that it comes full circle and we understand exactly who Jesus claims to be. I think in Matthew 28, another example that's interesting is at the Great Commission, where it says some disciples doubted. Now, again, in Bowman and Komashevsky's book, they make a really interesting take on this based on looking at the Greek, the original language. They said it may mean the disciples worshiped him at the same time having some doubt. But Bowman says Jesus responds to their doubt by assuring them of his universal authority. Evidently, Jesus was assuring them that the act of worship was quite appropriate. So it's not that they doubt, that they're still trying to figure out, what does it mean that this human being is Yahweh in human flesh? And he's like, all authority has been given to me. Let me assure you, this worship is correct. I think that's a really interesting take. Luke, I think there's a little more to Luke. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add one quick thing, because I always think in terms of how this stuff ties together. So that passage right there, where Jesus dies, he rises, and then he appears to his followers. They worshiped him, but some doubted. And then he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. But if you're interpreting that in light of, which I don't know how you wouldn't, Daniel 7:13-14, where the Son of Man coming on the clouds approaches the Ancient of Days, and he's given authority and sovereign power. And then it says, and he would be, peoples of all nations will worship him. And so he's given the authority. And what does Jesus say? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And they're worshiping him exactly as this says. Oh, and by the way, since Alex was talking about latruo there, he's saying that that's the worship of the one true God. latreuo is a kind of a broader term. It's like a kind of religious service, which would include worship. But it is interesting, since he's granting that latreuo means worship of the one true God. The word used in Daniel 7 of what the Son of Man coming with the clouds receives is latreuo there. So what's that mean? If Jesus in Matthew is claiming to receive that worship that the Son of Man is to be given, you've got latreuo and proskuneo there.
That's an interesting connection. I had not thought of that. I think the Luke passage is telling too. He's right, it appears 3 times, proskuneo in Luke, twice in the temptation narrative, which, just think about this. Luke chapter 4, 7 through 8 is the temptation narrative. Right after that, the title is The Beginning of the Ministry of Jesus. So it's capping off his ministry. And then the second one is following his resurrection appearances at the ascension in Luke 24 at the end. So proskuneo appears when the devil tempts Jesus, and Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 6:13. You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. That response from Deuteronomy 6 is worship only to God in person. Then it occurs at the ascension. When the disciples watch him, he leaves and it worships. And it says, while he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried out up into heaven. And they worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. And we see the same thing at the end of Matthew. So there's multiple attestation there. It's interesting that what Jesus refused to give the devil, he seems to welcome from the disciples. And the point at the end is we're supposed to take this as a model. They're telling us how to make disciples go to the ends of the earth. So I think, again, Bowman and Komashevsky conclude, they say, although the Bible does not contain statements that unambiguously present Jesus as the object of the verb latreuo, and I point this out because none of the arguments that Alex made are new. I'm not sure he would say that they're new. He was quoting other scholars. They might be new to people hearing this for the first time, but people have been responding to this back in many ways to the early church fathers wrestling with these questions. He says they don't unobjectionably present Jesus as the object of the verb latreuo, but it does closely associate Jesus with God in receiving religious service that verb expresses. That's exactly right. Debate is not about the word. The debate is about, are they actually worshiping him as God? And I think there's at least enough clear times where he does, even though most are more of a kind of prostration.
Yeah, and by the way, this is an example of saying, like for me in a debate, you put an argument out there, and now you've got sort of the first volley of criticism. So he objected to this, which I think I only mentioned for like 2 seconds in my opening statement. I gave a list of things that they're doing towards Jesus that you're supposed to be doing towards God. And so they're praying to him, they're worshiping him, they're singing hymns to him and about him. He becomes part of the church worship and so on. So anyway, I mentioned that, and he dedicated a lot of time to it. So what that tells me is when I'm coming up with, a revised version of the argument, actually spend like 2 minutes going kind of through, expanding upon it a little more and looking at a couple of passages.
It's a good lesson. By the way, it's easier for people, and myself included, a week after this to kind of Monday morning quarterback and go, well, you can make this, and here's numbers. Well, you're there in the moment trying to do this. So, kudos to you, kudos to Alex for having this conversation with a lot of people watching. I think on both sides we're learning a lot, clarifying the arguments. Last clip, and before I show it, this is not meant to be a gotcha moment. I think this, there's a lot of other clips we could show, but I think the point raised by God Logic was really significant and leads me into kind of a few last points that I want to make as well. So let's watch this final clip.
You mentioned in Hebrews 1 where, God is speaking, or God spoke to our, through prophets. Now he speaks to us through his son, and you're saying, where was Jesus then? Back then he should have been active. And so, regarding Hebrews, I just want to read you this and get your thoughts on this. Okay, it's Hebrews 11. Regarding Moses, it says, by faith, Moses, and I'm going to just skip down to 25 and 26 for time, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So how is it that Moses can be considering Christ's disapproval if Christ wasn't around for him to disapprove?
Yeah, that is a great question. So Christ there, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. Now, that's something which I think it's a good point. I mean, of course, I can offer a Christological interpretation of this, which sort of says that Christ is promised as the Redeemer of mankind, and we're looking at this in retro. Where's he gone? Oh, there you are. And we're looking and just dropped it and left. And I suppose we're looking at this in retrospect, and he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ. Yeah, I do think that in this instance, Hebrews is probably presenting Jesus as, I don't know about the angel of Yahweh, but certainly we're looking at a high Christology in Hebrews, yeah.
So close.
But, yeah, I see what you're saying.
All right, let's go to the next question because we only got a few. He's so close, guys.
But I have no, for what it's worth, I have no problem saying that Hebrews has a high Christology. That's kind of not an issue to me. But I think it is interesting to suggest that as a retort to the idea of the angel of Yahweh being Jesus, I think that is an excellent point. Yeah.
Well, I want to know your thoughts, but first off, Alex took that completely in stride. He took it well. We've all been on our stage going, you know what, maybe I would take this point back. But I'm really curious your takeaway from this and why you think it was a significant moment.
It was interesting because I wasn't even thinking of Hebrews 11 when he brought up he brought up Hebrews, but that I was just thinking, you're going to Hebrews 1? Are you joking? Right? I mean, let me just open Hebrews 1. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. So that's what he's quoting to respond to what I was pointing out about the angel of the Lord, which I only brought that up to show what led to the two powers in heaven. You have an angel of the Lord who's speaking as if he's the Lord. What's going on here? So he quotes that to basically argue that Jesus wasn't around back then because now he's speaking. It's in the last days that he's speaking by his Son. So obviously he's not the angel of the Lord, or he would have been speaking through him back then as well. But I mean, just keep reading. Whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. Look at how many times these things come up. He appointed heir of all things. So he's appointing him an heir. So there's a distinction there, and yet through whom he made the universe. So it's the same thing you find in John 1, that all things are created through Jesus. And so it's like, I mean, and even just a few verses later, in verse 6, God commands the angels to worship him, commands the angels to worship Jesus. Yeah. So if you put all the worship passages together, he's worshiped by men, he's worshiped by women in Matthew, I think 28:9, he's worshiped by the women. He's worshiped by demons. You pointed out the demon is terrified of him in
Mark 5.
And bows down. And then according to Hebrews 1, the angels worship him. And so it's like, who is this guy? And is it just saying that, hey, you can be like this too? You could be this great guy like Jesus too. But yeah, I wasn't even thinking about going to like Hebrews 11. It was still in my mind. You can't talk about Hebrews because they'll just say, you don't even know who wrote it, right? So I kind of adopted their skeptical approach. And I had to think like, should I do this or should I just go with just the New Testament as a whole?
You got to make those decisions. Yeah.
Like even before we debated, when I'm deciding to focus on the earlier material, I'm thinking, okay, focus on the earlier material. And it's like, should you do that as a Christian? And the example that popped into my head was when Jesus is talking to the Sadducees who didn't believe in the resurrection. And it's easy to show the resurrection from like the prophets and so on, but they don't believe in the Sadducees didn't believe in the prophets. They only believed in the first 5 books. So I'm thinking, what did Jesus quote? He quoted the first 5 books. He said, this is what you will grant. You're not going to grant if I quote Daniel or Ezekiel or something like this. So I'll quote what you actually believe in. So in my head, it's like, okay, if they're more inclined to believe in Mark and in Q, because that's what their scholars tell them, then I'll use that sort of material. So when he brings up Hebrews, I'm just thinking, Hebrews 1, seriously? I wasn't going to return to it. It was just, okay. But then God logic points out, no, even according to Hebrews, it's not just that Jesus is clearly described as like creating the universe. It's later on, he's there during the time of Moses, so he was there. So you can't say that just because in the last days he speaks by his Son, therefore the Son wasn't around back then. So I didn't enter my head. God logic brought it up, and God logic's a beast.
I think it was brilliant. What came to my mind is it says, long ago, many times in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. Now, does that mean he's still not speaking by prophets today in any fashion? We also know God speaks through creation. Is he not speaking through creation anymore? I think the answer is no. It's talking about the primary way that God speaks.
I agree with you.
And so if that's true, that he primarily speaks now, it doesn't mean that Jesus didn't speak as the angel of the Lord or the second Yahweh in the Old Testament. It just means now this is the clarifying primary voice. I think Alex does a really good job of raising these apparent contradictions and tensions, and a lot can't go addressed in a debate like this. But I think you go back one by one, and I think what we said earlier is right. There's good answers to this, and it makes sense in the text if we probe in the depth and look at it. I want to end by.
I just wanted to add one point there. What you just saw with God logic, it's kind of when we started off, I was pointing out that, like, my view of a debate, you put out your arguments and you see how people are going to respond to them and so on. People coming up with something and then maybe it slides throughout the debate. My view is I trust the body of Christ. I trust Christians.
That's fair.
You saw it in the debate right there where God logic steps up and jumps in with a point. But I already know if you offer a bad argument and I don't give an effective response to it, or I miss it or something like that, or I'm focusing on other things and arguing other things, and this point makes it through the debate and doesn't get responded to, we're in the age of the internet. Christians are going to respond to it. And so
skeptics will on the other side. It's going to ongoing
conversation. And it's in my mind, I believe my core argument is good. And I think it will stand the test of time even as people respond to it. In other words, as people respond to it, I will say, oh, okay, they think this point is weak. I will tweak that point. They think that I didn't offer enough evidence for this point. I'll strengthen that point. But the idea is, at the end of the day, I don't think skepticism responds to that basic argument that Jesus is clearly claiming to be one of the powers in heaven, and that Jesus claims this in multiple ways. His followers claim this in multiple ways. It's in so many places that, apart from just being like a mythicist or just saying I don't believe in any of this stuff, I don't think you can avoid it. As long as you grant that we have some kind of reliable records that are talking about Jesus' claims, and even if you dismissed all the Gospels, I think you could put this together just from what you read about Paul talking about the early church and their beliefs. I think something caused all these people to believe this very early on. What was it? Seems like something big. If you're going to convince a bunch of first century Jews that now they can pray to this guy, seems like it would have to be something big. One, he's got to be making some serious claims, and two, something needs to happen where they say, okay, even though this sounds really, really strange to us, we have to be on board. So I think all that stands the test of time. Responding by going to the Gospel of John and saying, what does this mean? What does that mean? What does this mean? It may work for the purposes of the debate. I don't think it stands like the test of time. And so we can actually test this right here. We can revisit this like 5 years from now and say, okay, how has one argument done and how has other? Because again, people are going to be arguing about this. You're pointing out Christians are going to be arguing this. Skeptics are going to be arguing about this. Alex, even as his arguments are criticized, like next time he has to take what God logic said into account, and he can't just use Hebrews 1 to try and dismiss something. And people will be responding to other things. So he's also going to tweak his arguments, and seems like he wants to go in a direction of using John to interpret Jesus as claiming something else that we're just missing. We're misunderstanding him. And so again, I think, hey, great, go to the Gospel of John, really, really do a deep dive into the Gospel of John and see how well that works out. If he comes up with a really effective argument that stands the test of criticism and time, then you've just got a good argument. I don't think it will, though.
The title, Did Jesus Claim to Be God, is somewhat narrow. It almost could be just like, Did Jesus Claim to be God in John? That almost could be a debate. Now, of course, even that, there's so many passages and nuances. But I think the basic argument that you made, like what Jesus said and did, what his enemies said and did, the breadth of the claim for the deity of Jesus is what convinces me. Growing up, I really thought it was just a few passages like John 20, 28, and some other passages maybe in Romans the more I've started to study, I see it quite literally everywhere. And you can only make sense historically about the beginning of the Christian faith, but also the text. When you unlock that Jesus really did see himself as God in human flesh. A few passages I just want to read because it reminded me of this, and we'll wrap up. If you have any other thoughts, I definitely want to make sure you get them out there.
I got one more.
But since the Hebrews passage came up, Hebrews 1:8 is where theos is used. There's probably 7 times where theos, usually reserved for God in the Old Testament, God the Father, is specifically applied to Jesus. Usually, as you know, a different term is used. And some of these are a little bit contested, but I think these interpretations are the most reasonable, historically speaking. Hebrews 1:8, but of the Son he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. John 1:1, this whole debate about John is framed by, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Theos. John 20:28, arguably the climax of the book. Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. Theos. That he's not saying, oh my God. That is not what he is saying.
Not a Jewish saying.
No chance. He's calling him that. Romans 9:5. Christ, who is God Theos over all. Titus 2:13. Waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. He's not saying God and the Savior, Jesus Christ. He's saying Jesus is God and Savior by Sharp's rule. 2 Peter 1:1, to those who have obtained a faith of equal standing with ours, by the righteousness of our God, Theos, and Savior, Jesus Christ. And the last one, and we know that the Son of God has come and given us understanding so that we may know him who is true. And we are in him who is true, in his Son, Jesus Christ. He is the true God and eternal life. David, I don't know about you, but I gave a message a few months ago on the name of God. It's crazy. There's been different seasons in my life, but when I really got into the name of Jesus and looking at Exodus 3, like when I just stop and think about the name of God, I can literally be moved to tears. Understanding that Jesus claimed to be God to me is the most powerful theological truth that literally, like in John, is it John 17, where Jesus is the I am and the people just fall down because of the power. There's power in the name of Christ. So people watch this, I would just plead with them. Rather than reading the New Testament saying, I'm going to find contradictions here, I'm going to find holes here, this can't be true. What if you just read the Gospel of John or Mark and say, who did Jesus really claim to be? Is it possible that he claimed to be God? That would be my last challenge for any skeptic who's watched this with us. Your final thoughts.
Yeah, 2 things. One, when you're pointing out that, if you look at what Hebrews actually says, if you look at what the Gospel of John actually says, what are the bookends on that book? There's sort of a fundamental principle of interpretation. Interpreting Scripture is don't interpret the clear in light of the unclear. Interpret the unclear in light of the clear. And so if you're going to a claim of Jesus and saying, oh, is this Jesus saying that they're gods, and so that's all he's claiming, or something? Is he just claiming that you're going to have the same relationship with God that I have, so we're basically all the same, or something like that? If you're interpreting something like that, and there are other interpretations of the exact same passage, it seems like you should be going to the clear. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, my Lord and my God, and saying, okay, these are clearly affirming Jesus as God. Therefore, when we go and we look at these passages, we need to make sure that our interpretations of passages that can be interpreted, and that even Christians have interpreted in multiple ways, that the interpretation lines up with the rest of what the book is saying. And I'm saying this because it's normally a thing that you see a lot from Muslims. They'll go to a verse and give it a meaning which is completely contradicted by all the rest of the text, but which they can interpret in light of Islam. And it just, in the long term, it comes across as kind of disingenuous if you keep going to that method. And that's why I said I don't think this would actually, it's not going to last. It's not going to last. Again, check back in a couple of years and see if this approach has lasted. I guarantee you Alex will be arguing in a completely different direction by then.
This is on film, so we'll revisit it in 5 years.
And the other thing was, as far as pointing out that if you want to know what Jesus claimed, there are different things you can look at: what Jesus said, what Jesus did, what his friends said, what his friends did, what his enemies said, what his enemies did. These are all giving you historical information about a person and how people were reacting to him. That came from Nabil. That was actually Nabil. I stole it. I modified it a little bit because he just said, this is after he became a Christian. He said he realized that if he wants to know what Jesus is claiming, Islam is saying one thing, Christians are saying something else. He said, if I want to actually look historically at Jesus, there are 4 things I can look at. He said, I can look at what Jesus said, I can look at what Jesus did, I can look at what others said about him, and I can look at what others did about him. And he said, I looked at those 4 things, and all of them pointed towards this guy making claims that do not make sense from Islam. And so he concluded that Jesus was making these claims about himself. And interestingly, he used that approach for about a year, and then he shifted his approach to where he just focuses on the ending of the Gospel of Mark and Mark 14, and argued based on that. But I always liked that original approach. After he became a Christian, he told me that's what he was thinking. I was like, I actually like that. I'm going to use that someday. So,
well, you ended your debate with a quote by C.S. Lewis. I'll take a quote by Nabil any day. Like you, miss him a lot. Well, thanks for doing the debate. Thanks for coming all the way out here to sit down with me. This is a lot of fun. I would love to know from you watching if this is helpful to you. I don't do a lot of weighing in and reaction videos like this, but if this is helpful, this is insightful. If you'd like to see more, also doing conversations like this in person, there's a price and cost to setting this up and sitting down together. We live on different coasts. Let me know. We really want to up our game on this channel and serve you as well as we can. Make sure you hit subscribe, and if you thought about studying apologetics, we'd love to have you at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University. David, always fun. Thanks.